Hey, okay, here we go, another one. So I last left off with I was just sort of finishing up some grass, and I just want to do a couple of quick house cleaning things with everyone. So um, first thing is I think I want to give the grass a little more gloss. Grass is a bit more like a waxy material. So what I probably want to do is in its main settings, look at that reflect glossy and maybe put that up to about 0.85, which should give me a nice white. That's too much, 0.8 maybe. That's pretty good. So um, let's see what 7.5 does. Let's call that good, 0.75. So we'll do that. The other little house cleaning thing that we need to do is in your V-Ray and the glass material, just make sure that you check affect shadows. Make sure that's checked, so that allows the natural light to come through the glass. It's a pretty important little feature, and sometimes it's not there by default. Okay, so I'm going to go through cameras right now, and I want to just talk about what a camera is and why we use it and what that means. So this is one of the best features about V-Ray, is the introduction of a physical camera, and that basically just means that in a virtual world we're emulating physical settings. So if you hit H, and you can sort of turn off all these to find your camera a little bit easier. There's my physical camera. So there's the camera itself, and then there's the target. So we're able to control and move the camera through the camera itself and its target. And I'm going to just select the camera itself. And here are all of my settings for the camera. So there's a lot of them. I'm under the Modify tab over here. So they're all here. You can see this little grid that shows up. It kind of helps me, line up things to make sure that all my horizontals and verticals are good. But if you wanna learn more about what some of these relationships are, this is it's a true physical camera. So you can there's a guide here. I'll send these links to you, but there's a guide here that sort of says the relationship between ISO, shutter speed, and aperture. Those are the three big things. ISO is it used to be when we shot with film, the film itself set the ISO, and then we set the camera to equal the film. Now we can adjust the ISO digitally, and ISOs can go well into the tens of thousands to be able to shoot in very, very low light situations, but it does create a very grainy result. When we shoot architecture, the most important thing we're trying to accomplish is clarity. We're trying to shoot information. So we want as little blurriness and noise as possible. We want absolute crisp, clear images. So we usually use an ISO of 100 and never change that. So we're really looking at shutter speed and aperture. Aperture is the best way to look at these two is aperture is kind of like the size of the window, and shutter speed is how long you open the window, the time that you open the window. So you can think of the volume of light that's hitting the sensor that creates the image is determined by the size of the window and how long it's open. So those are the things to do. And both of those have kind of inverse values, which you can start to understand. Let me get back into it. So film gate is 36. That's a 35 millimeter camera. In a digital world, it's a 36 is what's called a full frame. So we just leave that at 36. Most of your point and shoots or whatever digital camera you have is probably 35 millimeter. The focal length is determining the it's the zoom essentially of the lens. So you can see what happens if I take this down to a 12. I get a much wider view. If I take this to a 40, something like that, it's a much closer in view. So I'm zooming. It's like the zoom lens. I'm zooming in and out, and you can see, that you're going to get more distortion the further you go out. You're going to get more distortion, especially along the edges of the image. In architecture, I pretty much always set it at 22 and leave it. In a 36 film gate environment, a 22 is actually a 24. It's sort of funny, but the focal lengths of digital cameras, the way they translate into the old cameras, it's a little bit not exactly one-to-one. So the rule of shooting architecture is to shoot at 24, but in a digital world, at this 36, we're at 22. The F number, in V-Ray I keep it at 8. In reality, I always shoot at a 12. So let's keep it at a 12. And then we want to set the shutter speed to something. So essentially, with an f of 12, that means I'm going to get very little blurriness in the background. Everything's going to stay in focus, and that's really what I want to make sure happens. Um, so all we're really going to ever adjust in these cameras to get the right exposure is the shutter speed. We're going to leave the ISO, and we're going to leave the aperture. That's what this F number, that's our aperture. So to determine that shutter speed, if I'm doing a daylight scene, so I'm using this sky, right? It's a pretty, it's sort of cloudy day. I want to figure out what that is. I can use my exposure value chart from Wikipedia. I'll send you this link as well. The exposure value chart is right here. I can go down to here and see that it's a typical scene, cloudy bright. Let's call that an exposure value of 13. You can see that EV 100, that 100 means ISO 100, which is what we are. So I go up here, my exposure value is right here, 13, and I am an F of 12, which is not quite on here. So I'm going to be somewhere between 1 to 60 and 1 to 30, and I tend to like to underexpose my images just a little bit so that I have more control of them in Photoshop. So I'm going to do this at, let's do it at 50. Whoops, not 5, 50. And then I just want to do a quick render and see how that feels. So I'm just going to let this run in the light cache just to see how the exposure feels. It already looks like it's pretty overexposed. So I probably want to change that a little bit. My F12, 50. Maybe I want to look at that exposure value chart and really see what's going on. Maybe I'm, let's see, around 11 and 12, you know, so I could actually be anywhere between 60 and 250, because you look at 15 is a full, or, you know, full sunlight sort of thing, 15 and 16. So I'm going to just keep playing around, and this is what, when I'm shooting architecture in the field, this is what I do. I'm messing around with shutter speed all the time to see if I can get it to the right spot based on what the light's doing at that particular moment. And it changes moment to moment, you know, wherever the sun is, wherever the clouds are. It's constantly changing. So I'm always trying to get a sense of what that's like. The important thing, I think, is in the initial image to make sure that there's not a whole lot of detail blown out. If there are areas that are underexposed, if the image is a little darker, then maybe I want it to be in the final image. I don't have too much of a problem with that when I'm shooting. Again, underexposure is better than overexposure. When you underexpose, you can in Photoshop increase the brightness and you can get some of that detail back. If you overexpose, obviously that detail's gone. You can't really recover that anyway. But you don't want to obviously get too underexposed, because then you'll lose some of the power that the light gives you and that the camera gives you in a real world photography situation. So that's pretty good. I think I like that. The clouds are good. They're not too blown out. So I'm going to call that good. So now I want to move around. Now I want to set up my camera to do stuff. So there are several ways to do this. I think the easiest way is to be in the physical camera window, and I'm actually going to, right here, this little guy, I'm going to expand this out. And I like to keep this window about the same aspect ratio as the final image I'm going to render, so I have a pretty good sense of what that's going to look like. So I'm going to do this. The other thing you could do is hit this little plus sign and maximize viewport if you want, but I would just keep it like this just to keep it simple so you can always kind of go back. So I'm in here. Here are all my controls for moving around. This is my dolly, and if I hold my mouse button over that, you can see that here it just moves the camera, here it just moves the target, and here it moves the camera and the target. I usually do this one. Since we're not really doing depth of field, we're not doing a blurry background, where the target is relative to the camera is really no big deal. So this moves me in and out. Pushing the mouse wheel down pans me around. This we all know, right? We've all kind of got a good handle on that. So the next thing would be to rotate, to orbit the camera. And this is my orbit tool. Um, and the way that I choose to orbit is to hold down the shift key. So holding down the shift key keeps my verticals vertical. And this is a really big important thing in architectural photography, is keeping the vertical lines vertical. The biggest reason is, again, because you're trying to photograph information. It's not about stylizing the building. You really want to depict the building in a very honest way. It's sort of a big ethical thing about architectural photography, is making sure that we are presenting the building as it is and not distorting it too much. Obviously, we do Photoshop work and things, but you know, it's an interesting ethical debate. But I think the important thing is that you, as a rule, you keep the vertical lines vertical because it depicts the building in the best light possible. So this is what I can do. I can pan, I can orbit with my shift key held down, and I can dolly with the target. And that's how I do it. So how do I frame a scene? How do I make a scene exactly the way I want it? The best way to do that is to read through this guide, and I'll send you this link as well, but there's a guide here now that is a photographic approach to visualization, and you can start to look at what these composition values are. This is probably the most useful one to me, is to look at these 5 basic ways of composing an image: a central, full central part, frontal, typo, a corner, and a flat. And you can see some examples of each of those and what the power of those kinds of images are. There are also some rules about foreground, middle ground, background, and what you keep in focus and what you don't. We're really not we might get into doing some of these detail images, but I don't think it's likely we won't have time, so let's just not think about those very much. But you do want to look at this one as well, which is the rule of thirds in camera work. It's the rule of thirds kind of applies whether you apply it or not, whether you compose it or not. Our eye tends to go into thirds and thirds. So what's in the middle tends to be what we see, and that middle third right there is what we tend to see first or see most with our eye. So if we can compose an image so that what's most important is in that spot, then that's a good way of doing it. A lot of times you can do that, like with this shot. These 2 shots are doing it with an object. I actually like to do the brightest part of the image. So if I know the most amount of light is coming in one spot, I'll do it in that 1/3 spot. And then there's some stuff here about shading that we can skip over in lighting, because that's not what we're going to do. We're going to just use that V-Ray dome light that we have in there, which I think is the best way to do this, largely, again, because we're depicting information. We're not trying to do any kind of studio photography. We're actually trying to depict how daylight interacts in a space. So partly we can use it as a design tool. And then this last little bit is about white balance, which is a good idea to look at. You can see how the color white changes a lot in a space. It's just worth reading through to understand how all that goes. So I want to compose an image. I'm going to rotate myself around and kind of get this straight on and see what I want to do. Maybe I want to do this. One of the things that I think is also really powerful and a good idea to do in photography is to set the camera at about 3.5 to 4 feet off the ground. Mies did this great job of making walls 10 feet tall. Very commonly did walls at 10 feet because our eye levels are typically at about 5 feet, and that's kind of the way when we perceive space. It's sort of the strongest way of doing that. But most buildings are more at 8 to 9 feet. But I think even here, even though we're at the middle of the floor and roof, this could be an interesting scene, I actually think it's even more powerful to go down, really go down to the ground, and then maybe I want to dolly out to get a larger portion of the building. And then maybe I want to look at the rule of thirds here, and this is in the middle. What's at the third? Is it this or is it this? I can kind of decide which of those things I want to be at the third. And if you want to get a better sense of where that is, you can select your camera, and that gives you your grid. So I can see that there's 2, 2, and 4 in the middle. That's kind of in the thirds range, but I can get that door, perfectly centered if I want, and maybe I want to do it like that.